Sometimes the person who breaks your heart isn't the one you lose. It's the one you never realized you were already falling for. I never expected the worst night of Noah Carter's life to become the beginning of mine. For 3 years, we had shared apartment 4B on the west side of Portland, splitting rent, grocery bills, and the endless argument over whose turn it was to take out the trash. He was the kind of roommate everyone wanted, clean enough, respectful, funny without trying too hard, and somehow able to make an ordinary Tuesday feel less lonely. He also happened to be painfully straight, or at least that was what I had spent 3 years convincing myself to believe. That single fact became the invisible wall I never dared cross. No matter how many late-night conversations we shared over cold pizza, or how many Sunday mornings we spent watching old movies while rain tapped softly against our apartment windows. Loving someone who could never love you back was exhausting, but hiding it had become second nature. I buried every feeling beneath routines, telling myself that friendship was enough because it had to be. That Friday evening started like any other. I was sitting on our faded gray couch with my sketchbook balanced across my knees, finishing an illustration for a children's book publisher before a midnight deadline. The apartment smelled faintly of coffee and cinnamon because I had baked rolls that afternoon, hoping Noah would actually come home before they turned stale. He had texted me around lunch saying he was finally having dinner with Melissa, the woman he had been seeing for almost 8 months. There was a smiley face at the end of the message. I stared at it longer than I should have before putting my phone away. Around 10:30, thunder rolled somewhere beyond the city, and rain began falling hard enough to blur the streetlights outside. I remember glancing at the clock, wondering if he would stay at her place. Part of me hoped he would. It was always easier to miss him than to watch him fall deeper in love with someone else. Then I heard the front door unlock. It didn't swing open the way it usually did. There was no cheerful, "Hey, Ethan, you still awake?" No grocery bag hitting the kitchen counter. No keys tossed into the ceramic bowl by the entrance. Instead, the door eased shut with an almost careful silence. I looked up and barely recognized the man standing there. Noah's dark jacket was soaked from the rain, his brown hair dripping onto the hardwood floor, his shoulders slumped as though someone had quietly stolen every ounce of energy from his body. He didn't even notice me at first. He simply stood there staring at nothing, breathing slowly, like he had forgotten why he came home. I set my sketchbook aside. "Noah." He blinked once before looking at me. His blue eyes were red around the edges, not from tears but from the kind of disappointment that hollowed a person out from the inside. "Hey," he said softly, though the words sounded unfamiliar coming from him. "You okay?" I asked, already knowing the answer. He let out a quiet laugh that held no humor. "Melissa ended things." The room suddenly felt much smaller. I searched for something comforting to say, but every sentence sounded wrong inside my head. I settled for the truth. "I'm really sorry." He nodded once, slipped off his wet shoes, and walked into the living room with slow, uncertain steps. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Rain drummed against the windows while the clock above the television ticked louder than I had ever noticed before. Then Noah sat beside me on the couch, close enough that our shoulders almost touched. He stared straight ahead and whispered the last thing I ever expected to hear from him. "Ethan, would you stay with me tonight?" I looked at him for only a second before closing my sketchbook and sliding it onto the coffee table. There were probably 100 things I could have asked, but none of them seemed as important as the expression on Noah's face. He was not looking for advice. He was looking for somewhere safe to let the silence exist. So I simply nodded. "Of course." He let out a slow breath, almost as if he had been holding it since he walked through the front door. "Thanks." Neither of us spoke for a while. The rain continued tapping against the windows, filling every quiet corner of the apartment. I stood up and disappeared into the kitchen, pretending I suddenly remembered something important. Really, I just needed a moment to steady my own emotions. I placed 2 cinnamon rolls into the microwave, poured fresh coffee into matching mugs, then hesitated before adding extra cream to Noah's cup the way he always liked it. Some habits became automatic after 3 years. When I returned, he had changed into an old gray sweatshirt and sweatpants, his damp hair still slightly messy from the shower. He looked exhausted in a way that sleep alone could never fix. I handed him the warm plate without saying anything. His eyes drifted down before a faint smile appeared. "You saved me one. I always save you one." He laughed quietly. It was small, fragile, but it sounded like progress. We ate without turning on the television. The apartment felt unusually peaceful, almost protected from the storm outside. Eventually, Noah leaned back against the couch cushions and stared toward the dark window. Do you ever wonder how somebody can wake up loving you and go to sleep feeling nothing? His question caught me completely off guard. I knew exactly what that kind of heartbreak felt like, but my version had always been silent. I had never been brave enough to admit it. People change, I answered carefully. Sometimes faster than we expect. He nodded, but did not look convinced. Maybe I was not enough. I turned toward him immediately. Do not do that to yourself. Why not? He asked with a tired smile. Everybody says there has to be a reason. There does not always have to be one. He looked at me for several seconds, searching my face as though hoping I possessed some answer the rest of the world had forgotten. Then he quietly admitted, I do not really want to be alone tonight. My heart betrayed me with a painful warmth. I reminded myself that this had nothing to do with romance. He needed a friend, and that was exactly who I had promised to be. Nothing more. You are not alone, I said. Not tonight. We ended up watching an old comedy neither of us was actually paying attention to. Noah laughed at scenes that were not funny, and I noticed he kept absent-mindedly moving a little closer until our shoulders rested lightly against each other. It was probably unconscious. Maybe he simply needed the reassurance that someone was still there. I forced myself not to read meaning into something that likely had none. Around 1 in the morning, I noticed his breathing had slowed. He had fallen asleep sitting beside me, one arm loosely folded across his chest, his head resting gently against my shoulder. I stayed perfectly still, afraid even the smallest movement would wake him. Outside, the storm finally began to fade. Inside our tiny apartment, everything felt strangely different, though I could not explain why. For the first time since we became roommates, Noah was not hiding behind jokes or easy smiles. He had allowed me to see the pieces of himself that nobody else ever saw. I had spent years believing I was protecting my own heart by keeping my feelings hidden, but as I sat there listening to the quiet rhythm of his breathing, I realized something far more dangerous had begun. Without either of us noticing, our apartment no longer felt like a place we simply lived. It was quietly becoming the place where neither of us wanted to be without the other. I woke up with a stiff neck and the first rays of morning sunlight spilling through the living room window. For a brief second, I forgot why I had fallen asleep on the couch. Then I felt a familiar weight resting gently against my shoulder. Noah was still asleep, his breathing calm, one hand loosely curled against the blanket I had draped over both of us sometime during the night. He looked younger without the tension permanently sitting between his eyebrows, almost like the carefree guy who had first knocked on my apartment door 3 years earlier, carrying nothing but 2 duffel bags and an embarrassing amount of confidence. I carefully shifted just enough to reach my phone without waking him. 8:15. I had already missed 2 emails from my editor asking about revisions. Normally that would have sent me into a panic, but somehow it did not matter as much this morning. Noah stirred a few moments later, blinking slowly before realizing where he had fallen. Asleep. He immediately sat upright. I am sorry, he said. You probably slept terribly. I stretched my sore shoulders and smiled. I have definitely had worse nights. He rubbed the back of his neck with an embarrassed laugh. Thank you for staying. There was something different about the way he said it. It was not simply polite gratitude. It sounded genuine, almost relieved. We spent the morning making pancakes together because neither of us wanted to talk about what had happened the night before. Noah insisted on cooking the eggs, even though he always overcooked them, while I pretended not to notice. The familiar routine somehow felt comforting. After breakfast, I expected him to disappear into his room like anyone recovering from heartbreak would probably do. Instead, he followed me into my small home office where I worked as an illustrator. Mind if I hang out in here? He asked. I looked up from my tablet. Do not you have a million things to do? Probably. He shrugged. I just do not really feel like being by myself today. I pointed toward the old armchair by the window. It is all yours. He settled into the chair with a novel, but barely turned a single page over the next 2 hours. Every now and then I caught him watching me draw before quickly pretending to read again. It was oddly comforting, even if neither of us acknowledged it. That afternoon we walked to the neighborhood grocery store, something we had not done together in months because our schedules rarely lined up anymore. Noah wandered slowly through every aisle, tossing random snacks into the cart with absolutely no plan. We definitely do not need 3 different kinds of popcorn, I pointed out. Maybe future Noah will appreciate present Noah. Future Ethan is going to complain while carrying all of this upstairs. He grinned for the first time since the breakup, and I realized how much I had missed seeing that expression. On the walk home, he reached over without thinking and took one of the grocery bags from my hand. Our fingers brushed for only a second before separating again, but the warmth lingered longer than it should have. I kept reminding myself that heartbreak changed people. He was simply leaning on the closest person he trusted. That was all. Later that evening, while I answered emails from clients, Noah appeared in the doorway holding 2 mugs of hot chocolate. Coffee seemed like a bad idea this late, he said. You remembered. Of course I remembered. You always switch to hot chocolate after 8 because caffeine keeps you awake. I stared at him, surprised by how naturally those words came out. We all noticed little things about people we lived with, but this felt different. It sounded like someone who had been paying attention for much longer than either of us realized. As he handed me the mug, our eyes met for a brief moment. Neither of us looked away immediately. Then his phone buzzed loudly on the kitchen counter. The screen lit up with Melissa's name. Noah looked at it for several silent seconds before turning the phone face down without answering. Instead, he pulled out the chair beside mine and quietly asked, "Can I stay in here while you work again?" I smiled before returning to my drawing. You never have to ask. The days that followed settled into a rhythm neither of us talked about, but both of us quietly protected. Noah no longer rushed out of the apartment before sunrise or stayed out late after work. Instead, he came home almost every evening before I finished my last illustration, leaning against the kitchen counter while I made dinner as if that had always been the plan. Sometimes he chopped vegetables with surprising concentration. Sometimes he simply watched me while telling stories about impossible clients from the marketing firm where he worked. I noticed that he laughed a little more each day, and every time he did, the apartment felt brighter in a way that had nothing to do with the weather outside. One Saturday morning, he appeared in my doorway wearing an old baseball cap and holding 2 reusable shopping bags. "Farmer's market?" he asked. "You hate waking up before 9 on weekends." Maybe I am trying something new. I narrowed my eyes suspiciously. "Who are you, and what have you done with my roommate?" He laughed and tossed me my jacket. "Come on. Fresh air is supposed to be good for people with broken hearts." We spent the next few hours wandering through rows of local vendors, sampling homemade jam, arguing over which bakery sold the best sourdough, and listening to a college band play familiar songs in the town square. At one booth, an elderly woman selling handmade candles smiled at us before asking, "How long have you 2 been together?" Noah nearly dropped the paper bag he was carrying. I felt my face grow warm as I quickly answered, "Oh, we are just roommates." "Really?" she asked with a kind smile. "Well, you certainly take care of each other like family." Neither of us corrected her after that. We simply thanked her and continued walking, both strangely quiet for the next several minutes. That afternoon, we stopped by a bookstore because Noah insisted he needed a new novel. Instead of browsing the mystery section where he usually disappeared for half an hour, he wandered over to the art shelves where I was flipping through an illustration collection. "You always smile when you look at these," he said. "I guess drawing still makes you happier than anything else." I looked at him, surprised he had noticed something so small. "You remember that?" "I remember a lot more about you than you probably realize." The words landed somewhere deep inside me, and before I could think of a response, he casually picked up the book I had been admiring and carried it to the checkout counter. "Noah, you do not have to buy that." "Maybe not," he replied, smiling. "But I wanted to." Back at the apartment, the evening settled in with soft golden light pouring through the living room windows. Noah disappeared into the kitchen while I unpacked groceries, and a few minutes later the unmistakable smell of garlic and butter drifted through the apartment. "You are cooking?" I called. "Do not sound so surprised. Last time you tried making pasta, the smoke alarm almost filed a complaint." "I have improved," he answered proudly. To my amazement, he had. Dinner was simple, but it was easily the best meal he had ever made. Halfway through eating, he looked across the table and asked, "Do you think people can become happier without even noticing it?" I thought about the past week, about movie nights, grocery runs, quiet conversations, and mornings that somehow felt lighter than before. "I think happiness usually sneaks in when we stop looking for it," I said. Noah rested his chin in his hand and smiled thoughtfully. "That makes sense. After dinner, we washed dishes together, bumping shoulders every few minutes in our tiny kitchen. It was such an ordinary evening that it should have disappeared into memory like hundreds before it. Instead, it stayed with me because somewhere between passing clean plates back and forth and laughing over a broken coffee mug, I realized everyone around us would probably assume we were already a couple. The strange part was not that strangers kept making that mistake anymore. The strange part was that for the first time, I had stopped correcting the thought inside my own heart. By the second week, our apartment no longer felt divided into my space and Noah's space. It had quietly become ours in ways neither of us ever discussed. We had fallen into small routines that happened so naturally, they almost seemed inevitable. Every morning he made coffee before I woke up because he claimed my version was too strong. Every evening, I left a plate on the counter if I knew he would be working late, even though he almost always came home before dinner now. We never planned these habits. They simply appeared one after another, weaving themselves into ordinary days until they became impossible to separate from daily life. One Friday evening, the weather turned unusually warm for early spring, and Noah suggested we take our dinner up to the roof of our apartment building. We carried folding chairs, sandwiches, and 2 bottles of sparkling water upstairs just as the sun began sinking behind the Portland skyline. The city glowed in soft shades of gold and orange while a cool breeze drifted between the neighboring buildings. We talked about everything except the subjects that mattered most. He told me embarrassing stories about his first job in high school. I admitted I once accidentally sent a rough character sketch to a publisher instead of the finished artwork. He laughed so hard he nearly spilled his drink. 4. The first time since I had known him, there was no trace of the heartbreak that had followed him home that rainy night. It was as if joy had slowly found its way back without asking permission. As darkness settled over the city, tiny lights began appearing in apartment windows all around us. Noah leaned back in his chair and looked up at the stars that managed to peek through the city glow. "You know," he said quietly, "I thought I was going to spend weeks feeling miserable. Instead, you had to put up with me every day," I teased. He smiled without taking his eyes off the sky. "I think that is exactly why I stopped feeling miserable." My heartbeat stumbled before I could stop it. I forced myself to laugh lightly, pretending the words had not reached somewhere dangerously deep inside me. A gentle breeze lifted a loose strand of hair across my forehead. Without thinking, Noah reached over and brushed it away with quiet, absent-minded care. His fingertips barely touched my temple, but the simple gesture froze both of us. His hand lingered in the air for a fraction of a second longer than either of us expected. We looked at each other without speaking. The laughter from another rooftop somewhere nearby faded into the distance. Even the traffic below seemed strangely quiet. I could see confusion in Noah's blue eyes, but there was something else there too, something softer than friendship and too uncertain to name. Neither of us moved. My thoughts raced in every direction at once. Part of me wanted to look away before I imagined feelings that were never there. Another part of me wanted time itself to stop. The space between us felt impossibly small. Noah's gaze drifted briefly toward my lips before returning to my eyes. My breath caught almost instinctively. For one impossible moment, it felt as though the entire world had narrowed to the quiet distance separating us. Then a loud ringtone shattered the silence. Noah blinked, startled, and quickly leaned back in his chair as though waking from a dream. He pulled his phone from his pocket and frowned at the screen. It was his younger sister, Emily. He answered immediately, his voice returning to its familiar warmth. "Hey, Em, is everything okay?" I looked away toward the city lights, trying to slow my heartbeat before he noticed anything unusual. While Noah spoke with his sister about their parents' anniversary dinner the following weekend, I quietly reminded myself of something I had repeated for years. He was my roommate. He was my closest friend. He had just survived a broken relationship and was learning how to trust happiness again. Whatever had almost happened a few seconds earlier could not mean what my heart desperately wanted it to mean. Yet as we packed up our chairs and walked back downstairs together, I noticed our hands brushed against each other 3 separate times in the narrow stairwell. Neither of us reached away quite as quickly as we once would have. The moment on the rooftop refused to leave my mind. I replayed it while making breakfast, while answering client emails, even while standing in line at the neighborhood coffee shop. Every version ended the same way. Noah's hand brushing my hair away. The silence. The way he had looked at me before his phone interrupted whatever might have happened next. I hated myself for thinking about it so much because hope had always been the fastest way to get hurt. By Monday morning, I had convinced myself that distance was the only sensible answer. Noah deserved time to heal without my feelings complicating everything, and I needed space before I started believing in something that existed only inside my imagination. So I quietly changed our routine. I accepted a temporary contract that allowed me to work from a shared studio downtown instead of from the apartment. I left earlier each morning, returned later each evening, and answered most of Noah's messages with short but friendly replies. Nothing dramatic, nothing obvious, just enough to create a little room between us. The first evening I came home after 8, I found Noah sitting alone on the couch with 2 bowls of pasta already growing cold on the coffee table. He looked up the moment the front door opened. "You were late," he said. "Sorry. The project took longer than I expected." He glanced toward the untouched second bowl. "I thought we were eating together. You should have started without me." He nodded slowly, but something in his expression dimmed. We ate in near silence before I excused myself, claiming I still had revisions to finish. Inside my room, I sat at my desk staring at a blank screen for almost 20 minutes without drawing a single line. The next morning, Noah knocked softly on my bedroom door before I left. "Do you want coffee?" "I already grabbed one on my way back from my run." I lied. He looked surprised because I almost never went running. "Oh, okay." As the week continued, the small distance grew larger than I intended. Noah stopped waiting in my office while I worked because I was rarely home. Movie nights quietly disappeared. Grocery shopping became separate errands instead of shared afternoons. Even our conversations became shorter, limited to practical things like rent payments or whose turn it was to buy laundry detergent. I told myself it was healthier this way. Every night that excuse felt less convincing. Then Friday arrived. I was packing my laptop into my bag at the studio when my phone buzzed. It was Noah. "Are you coming home soon?" I smiled without meaning to before forcing myself to stay careful. "Probably around 9. What?" 3 dots appeared, disappeared, then appeared again. Finally, his reply came through. "No reason. Just wondering." When I walked into the apartment almost 2 hours later, the lights were still on. Noah was sitting at the kitchen table with an untouched cup of tea in front of him. He looked up immediately. "You are finally home. You waited up?" He shrugged, pretending it was no big deal. I could not sleep. I set my bag down and noticed a board game sitting unopened beside him. It was one we had bought months ago, but never played. "You were planning to play this by yourself?" I joked gently. He gave me a tired smile that disappeared almost instantly. "Actually, I was hoping you would be here." The honesty in his voice caught me completely off guard. Before I could answer, he looked down at the table and quietly asked, "Did I do something wrong?" My heart sank. "What do you mean?" "Ever since last weekend." He hesitated, searching for the right words. "You have been somewhere else, even when you were standing right in front of me. You leave early. You come home late. You barely talk anymore." He finally looked back at me, and for the first time since Melissa had left him, I saw that same lonely expression return to his eyes. "I keep thinking about what changed," he whispered. "Because whatever it is, I miss you already." That question stayed suspended between us, too honest to ignore and too painful to answer carelessly. I looked at Noah across the kitchen table, searching for a version of the truth that would not destroy everything we had built together. "You did not do anything wrong," I said quietly. "Then why does it feel like I lost you too?" His words landed harder than he probably realized. I looked away for a moment, pretending to straighten the strap on my laptop bag because meeting his eyes suddenly felt impossible. "People need space sometimes," I replied, "even from people they care about." Noah frowned. "Is that what you wanted? Space from me?" I could not answer immediately because the real answer was the exact opposite. Every hour away from him had felt longer than it should have. Every quiet dinner, every empty evening, every unanswered joke had hurt far more than staying close ever had. But I could not tell him that. Not when I still believed his heart belonged somewhere I could never follow. "I just thought it might be healthier," I finally whispered. Noah stood slowly and walked toward the living room window, folding his arms as he stared out at the street below. Cars drifted past beneath the yellow glow of the streetlights while a light rain began tapping softly against the glass. "Funny," he said with a tired smile. "I thought being around you was the healthiest I had felt in weeks." Neither of us spoke after that. Eventually, I wished him good night and retreated to my room, but sleep never came. I lay awake staring at the ceiling until sunrise painted pale lines across my bedroom wall. The next morning, I quietly left the apartment before Noah woke up. I needed fresh air more than coffee. I wandered through Waterfront Park with my hands buried in my jacket pockets, watching joggers, dog walkers, and families beginning their Saturday. Everyone seemed to know exactly where they belonged. I was the only one walking in circles. Around noon, my phone buzzed. It was my longtime friend Lily, who owned the small publishing agency that had given me my first illustration job years ago. She insisted I meet her for lunch downtown because, according to her message, I had been acting suspiciously mysterious. Lily had always been impossible to fool. The moment I sat across from her at our favorite sandwich shop, she tilted her head and asked, "What happened?" "Nothing. Ethan." She folded her arms. "You have that face." "What face?" "The one you had when you secretly liked someone in college and convinced yourself they would never like you back." I laughed weakly. Apparently, my face has not improved much. She smiled gently. "Is it the roommate?" I stared down at my drink instead of answering. After several quiet seconds, that was answer enough. Lily reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "Does he know?" "No." "Why not?" "Because I would rather keep him in my life as a friend than lose him completely." She nodded thoughtfully before asking the question I had been avoiding for years. "Are you protecting him or protecting yourself?" I opened my mouth, but no words came out. She already knew the answer. We spent another hour talking about work, old memories, and everything except my feelings. By the time we finished lunch, I felt lighter, though not because anything had been solved. Sometimes being understood was enough. As I stepped outside the restaurant, I reached for my phone to check the time. There were 6 missed calls from Noah. Before I could call him back, another call came through. I answered immediately. "Noah." His voice arrived breathless, filled with a panic I had never heard before. "Ethan, where are you?" "Downtown." "What happened?" There was a long pause before he spoke again, his voice quieter now, but shaking with emotion. "I came home early because I wanted to fix things between us." Another pause. "Then I saw your desk." My heart skipped. The moving company brochure I had picked up earlier that week was still sitting there beside my sketchbook. I had never planned to use it. I had only taken it because I thought leaving might be the only way to stop loving him. Noah's next words barely rose above a whisper. "Please tell me you are not planning to leave me." I stood frozen on the crowded sidewalk, the sounds of passing traffic fading into the background as Noah's words echoed through my mind. "Please tell me you are not planning to leave me." I closed my eyes for a brief moment before answering honestly. "I am coming home." I ended the call without saying anything else and caught the first streetcar heading back toward our neighborhood. The 20-minute ride felt endless. Every possible conversation played through my head, and every version ended with me losing the one person I had spent years trying not to love. When I finally unlocked the apartment door, Noah was already standing in the entryway, as though he had been waiting there the entire time. Neither of us spoke immediately. The silence between us no longer felt awkward. It felt fragile. His eyes drifted toward my face before quietly asking, "Were you really thinking about moving out?" I let out a slow breath. I picked up the brochure because I thought it might be easier. "Easier for who?" he asked. "For both of us." Noah shook his head almost immediately. "No. Do not decide what is easier for me without asking me." I looked down at the floor. "You deserved a chance to move on after Melissa." I did not want to become another complication. He stared at me with visible confusion. "A complication?" I nodded. "You have been through enough already." He stepped closer until only a few feet separated us. "Ethan, you are the reason I got through it." His voice remained calm, but every word carried a quiet certainty that made my heart race. "When everything fell apart, you were there. Every morning, every night, every ordinary moment that somehow made life feel normal again." I swallowed hard, knowing I could not keep hiding forever. That is exactly why I needed distance. Noah frowned. "I still do not understand." I laughed softly, though there was very little humor in it. "Because I stopped being able to pretend." He searched my face, waiting. For the first time in years, I stopped protecting myself with careful words. "I have loved you for a long time, Noah." The apartment fell completely silent. I continued before fear could stop me. Long before Melissa. Long before that rainy night. "I never expected anything from you because I believed you could never feel the same way. When you started depending on me after the breakup, I told myself it was temporary. Then everything changed, and I realized staying close was becoming harder than walking away. Noah did not interrupt once. He simply listened, his expression shifting from surprise to something much softer. After several long seconds, he quietly asked, "Is that why you pulled away?" I nodded. "I thought if I stayed, I would eventually lose you anyway." He took another small step forward. "You almost did." My heart sank. "I am sorry." Noah smiled sadly and shook his head. "Do you know what terrified me when I saw that brochure?" I looked at him without speaking. It was not the thought of finding another roommate. He exhaled slowly. It was imagining coming home and you not being here anymore. His eyes glistened with emotion, but his voice never wavered. "Ever since that night when I asked you to stay with me, nothing has felt right unless you were nearby. I kept telling myself it was because I was recovering from the breakup. Then you started disappearing, and I realized I was not missing comfort." He smiled almost nervously before admitting the truth. "I was missing you." My heartbeat became impossibly loud. Noah looked down for a moment before meeting my eyes again. "I do not have all the answers. I do not know what label fits me anymore, and maybe I do not need one today. What I do know is that every plan I make somehow includes you. Every good day feels better because you are part of it. And when I thought you were leaving..." He paused, taking a slow breath. "I realized home has never been this apartment. Home has been the person waiting inside it. Please, do not leave. Stay with me. Not because I need someone to help me heal anymore. Stay because I cannot imagine my life without you." I could not remember who moved first. Maybe it was both of us. Maybe it did not matter. The distance between us disappeared with a single step, and Noah wrapped me in the kind of hug that asked for nothing except honesty. There was no dramatic moment, no cheering crowd, no perfect speech waiting in the background. There was only the quiet certainty that neither of us wanted to keep pretending anymore. I rested my forehead lightly against his shoulder and laughed through the emotion building in my chest. "You know," I said softly, "you make it very difficult to leave." He smiled. "Good. That was the plan." We stayed there for a long moment, saying nothing because there was nothing left to explain. Sometimes silence carried more truth than words ever could. The weeks that followed did not transform our lives overnight. We still argued about whose turn it was to buy groceries. Noah still forgot to replace the empty milk carton in the refrigerator. I still left pencils scattered across every flat surface in the apartment. The ordinary parts of life stayed exactly the same. The difference was that neither of us questioned whether the other would still be there tomorrow. We simply assumed it, and somehow that assumption became the safest feeling either of us had ever known. A month later, Noah invited me to his parents' anniversary dinner. Halfway through dessert, his mother smiled warmly before saying, "It has been a long time since I have seen Noah this happy." Noah looked across the table at me instead of answering. His father noticed the glance, smiled quietly to himself, and changed the subject without making anyone uncomfortable. During the drive home, Noah laughed and admitted, "I think my parents figured it out before we did." I smiled through the open passenger window as cool evening air drifted inside the car. That would not surprise me. Summer arrived before either of us realized how much time had passed. One Saturday morning, we returned to the same farmer's market where the elderly woman had mistaken us for a couple weeks earlier. As we wandered past the flower stands, we recognized her arranging fresh lavender at her booth. She looked up, smiled immediately, and said, "Well, it is nice to see you two again." Noah glanced toward me before answering with an easy smile that carried no hesitation this time. "It is nice to see you too." There was no need for explanations. We bought 2 candles, thanked her, and continued walking through the market with the same quiet comfort that had once only existed inside our apartment. Life continued moving forward in wonderfully ordinary ways. My illustration book was finally published, and Noah insisted on organizing a small celebration with our closest friends, even though I would have been perfectly happy ordering pizza at home. When the first printed copy arrived, he placed it proudly on the bookshelf in our living room before saying, "This belongs where both of us can see it every day." I realized then that he celebrated my dreams as though they were part of his own. About a year after that rainy night changed everything, I unlocked the apartment door after finishing an afternoon meeting with my publisher. The familiar smell of fresh coffee drifted from the kitchen, followed by Noah's voice calling, "You are home." I smiled before answering, "I am." Those simple words carried a meaning they never had before. On the hallway wall hung a framed photograph from our trip to the Oregon coast, both of us laughing as the wind tried to steal our jackets. Beside the front door, the small nameplate that our landlord had finally replaced now read exactly what it should have from the beginning. Ethan Brooks, Noah Carter, two names sharing one home. Looking back, I finally understood something I had spent years searching for. Love did not arrive with grand speeches or perfect timing. It quietly built itself through shared breakfasts, late-night conversations, grocery lists, laughter over burned dinners, and the simple promise of always coming back through the same front door. Sometimes the greatest love story does not begin with someone falling into your life. Sometimes it begins when the person who already feels like home softly asks, "Will you stay?" And the happiest ending is realizing you never wanted to leave.